So yeah, I'll start because I've got a lot of material to cover. I'll start by saying I'm gonna try and purposely shorten it. But that if you're really interested and you don't think I'm a total idiot, the whole video is on my YouTube channel, and I also have a transcript on my website. So if you want to go into greater detail, you'll find it there. I want to start by saying that I'd like you to take away from this lecture some practical understanding of dialectical thinking as a tool that hopefully will be useful for thinking through complex problems in your own way, in the way you personally relate to these problems. It's just a tool, and at the same time I want to give you sort of the way I personally relate to dialectical thinking, and give you sort of a very explicit look at the way that I've come to understand dialectical thinking and the way I've come to engage with dialectical thinking and the thinkers who impressed upon me the importance of it. But again, that's just my encounter with it, and what I want you to take away is just the basic tools of the dialectic so that you can apply it in your own way to the problems that you perceive, which will be maybe different than the problems that I perceive. There is one thing, like an important theoretical point that I want to make that sort of captures in some sense the way I relate to dialectical thinking, that I've come to realize actually through trying to design this lecture, capture the two basic questions that structure my interest as an academic. So my interest as an academic started with a desire to understand. For me personally, I had an intuition that humans were different than the rest of nature, and I was interested in that difference. So I was first drawn to studying the difference between humans and the great apes, for example. And came to see language, as most people, came to see language and culture and technology as things that uniquely emerged in our evolutionary lineage. And then the second question that structured my interest as an academic was basically future speculations related to the singularity. So things like artificial intelligence and robotics and genetic engineering and nanotechnology, this suite of emerging technologies which seem to suggest that something interesting was going to happen in the 21st century. I still remember reading, for example, Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, and being very emotionally and intellectually moved by it, and in fact started to live almost like a double intellectual life, where at the university I would be studying human evolution, anthropology, and stuff like that, and then in my spare time I would be on obscure transhumanist blogs looking at how I can transcend my existence and stuff like this. So where I situate the dialectic, basically where I've come to philosophically, is kind of like seeing the dialectic as a bridge between a qualitative transition from our emergence in language to our potential leaving what it means to be human. Here what comes to mind is Heidegger's notion that language is the house of being. But it's the house of our being, our particular way in which we relate to being human, and that there's some sort of evolutionary process in which we're a bridge between, and to me the dialectic might be a way to bridge these two realms. To me, I see the dialectic as simply the movement of reason, and the process of reason's becoming, and where I would situate it in between two different things that I think come to dominate our intellectual life today. I would say how I experience or how I understand the history of academia in the last 20, 30, 40 years or something like that is that there's two camps, broadly speaking. One camp is kind of like a scientists trying to do ontology, I would say, like, quantum cosmology, the brain sciences, cognitive science, evolutionary science, basically scientists who think in such a way as if modern or traditional philosophy is no longer of extreme importance, that science can now take over where philosophy used to be, and that if we just understand quantum cosmology, the brain sciences and stuff like this, that we'll have enough to get us where we want to go. And my perspective on this camp is that they try to develop a meta-language, and that it's at the heart of science to try to develop a meta-language, like from Leibniz and stuff like this. So there's kind of this, how I experience, like a lot of communities I've visited, they all try to develop a universal language, like kind of like an objective language that then they would share with everyone. You know, like we discovered the concepts, now we're going to share them with everyone, and that's the language we're going to use. So it's kind of like some asymptotic approach to an eternal language that we're all going to share. That's how I experienced that camp. And then the other camp, and I don't know what camp I like or dislike more, but the other camp is kind of like historical relativist camp. Like they're the deconstructionists. They tend to dominate social theory, gender theory, literary theory, and they come to say basically that everything is historically relative. There's all of the modernist concepts of universal truth and universal understanding and some universal historical interpretation. All of this is nonsense. This is Western civilization's particular delusion, and so forth. And that basically it brings you to a type of, in my view, a type of, there's like two ways in which you can like logically deal with that horizon. It's kind of like a multiplicity of games which nothing really matters too much, or you just like recede from language altogether, like you just become a Buddhist basically. We're just going to go back to the substance. Like this language as a house of being thing was a mistake, right? Like, but there's the two quotes I have here that sort of like capture like the meta level purpose for me of how I relate to these two camps. Is I quote someone who's influential to me, Jacques Lacan. So for the scientific camp, I would say he had the axiom, there is no meta-language, or there is no other of the other. And what that means, there is no meta-language or there is no other of the other, basically means there is no absolute container in language for you to grab onto and be with, and that would give you some objective grounding of where we are in history kind of thing. Like, there's no way to objectivize yourself, basically. Like, you're stuck in your partiality and your limitation. And then the other thing is that he modified Heidegger saying, language is the torture house of being. And language is the torture house of being is, I think, an important differentiation from Heidegger, in the sense that if you want to make progress in language, you kind of have to torture it or be tortured by it. Like like Terence McKenna said, culture is not your friend, and I think it's basically trying to communicate the same thing. Like, if you're not really thinking, language will control you and language will speak you. So if you're not constantly vigilant in language, if you're not very active and aggressive in language, I feel the way I approach literature is like I imagine myself with a sword on a mountain, like I'm gonna cut your head off, like that's, and I find it extremely useful. Like, you can actually, I think, by twisting and by torturing language, you can think something new. Because at least how I find it is like, you'll hear a lot of ideology, basically. Like, you'll hear people come at you with the same lines and the same structures and the same thing, but they're not really thinking. Like, that they're basically being subordinated to the symbolic chain, almost. Like they're really in the chain, and they like the chain. But my point is that I want to situate dialectical thinking between these two opposites. Like, it's like really just the motion of reason and the that the truth is not the completion of an identity, or neither the negation of identity, but almost the temporal annihilation of identity, the play of figures of consciousness in some sense, and that's in some sense what I hope the thinking school would become in some sense. So I have you know, again, all of this is probably much more formal and better said in the transcript and in the video, but what I want to emphasize is, like, in regards to absolute knowledge or something like that, is like absolute knowledge is not this complete, total understanding of everything. To me, it's the opposite of that. It's like more of a subtraction, like it's more of a realization that there's no absolute other or absolute background to which you could align yourself with. And in that sense, what happens is that your very self-relativization or your self-limitation, your very embodying of a relativization or your embodying of a limitation, paradoxically unites you with something that might be absolute in some meaningful sense. And by absolute and by, like, invariant or, like, by eternity, like, I mean, you know, almost like with reason you can, in some sense, transcend space and time. Like, if you're open, or if you're open and if you're attentive, like what we were talking about last night, attention and love being something similar. Like, if you're open, if you're attentive, if you're really present, and the person who's speaking is really speaking reason, that it's true independent of space and time. Like that's why it's worth it to even bother reading Plato. Like, yeah, he was writing however many years ago, like, but it's still relevant, like, somehow. Like, that's the magic of it in some sense. So I added this slide last night because I wanted to be totally transparent with who has inspired me the most in the last, and what school, like, and I've got, like, very coherent understanding now of what they think. So this is the particular school in which I've been exposed to dialectics. So the popular, everyone probably knows Slavoj Žižek. In the popular culture, you might think Slavoj Žižek is the figurehead of this movement. But as I've actually gone into the academic literature and dived very deeply into it, it's very clear that Alenka Zupančič is the head of this movement. And it kind of reminded me of something Marta shared one time on the Echo listserv, which was related to like the wife or the mother being always in the background but always fundamental, you know, like and that the man maybe gets the public notoriety or recognition, like on any like for example, just to give like the most famous books you'll see dedicated to my wife, dedicated to my significant other, or something, like, because those I really believe those conversations between the man and the woman, those intimate conversations, lead to some interesting knowledge production. I almost feel like Alenka Zupančič is like this, like like Slavoj Žižek is going to get the YouTube video hits, right? And he's going to get, like, the big popular media attention, but if you read Alenka Zupančič, it's really starting there to me. Like, so I'd recommend her book, Ethics of the Real, is a fantastic book, and also her newest book, What is Sex? And then Slavoj's masterworks, Less Than Nothing and Absolute Recoil. They're the books that really stick with me as the important literature. So what they try to do is they try to reinvent philosophy through psychoanalysis. Their basic claim is that philosophy as this traditional subject of absolute knowledge, or, like, you know, eternal wisdom or absolute truth, requires that we better understand the psyches, basically, that are even bothering to do this in the first place, like, and that it's worth it, actually, to revive philosophy through psychoanalysis. And that's against kind of like the deconstructive turn in philosophy, you know, like the deconstructive turn in philosophy is kind of like saying, you know, none of these philosophers had the absolute truth or the true wisdom, and we could, like, deconstruct them to their historically relative position and so forth, and show in the way in which they're just contingent idiots, you know. but through psychoanalysis, I think you get far more depth, far more understanding of why people even bother becoming philosophical, or why people even bother becoming religious, for that matter. The impulse is very similar, I think. So basically their claim is that what psychoanalysis brings then is that we should be trying to rethink what absolute knowing is after the discovery of the unconscious. That philosophy before the discovery of the unconscious labored under the pretense of too much self-transparency. like it labored under the pretense that like they really knew themselves or what they were doing or what they were up to, and that by injecting an understanding of the unconscious, we get a better understanding of our desire to explain the whole of reality or something like that, some universal structure of being. And I think what they come to in like their concrete analyses is like, one, the problem of enjoyment, like both the problem of feeling a lack of enjoyment, a lack of an ability to enjoy, and on the other hand, the inability to get rid of this enjoyment, like the inability to like for example, last night for me at the France celebration, like I see everyone enjoying, and I'm just like, not really, but then feeling like, why am I not enjoying? Like
you're in French.
Right. Well, but not no, but even when I was a teenager, like I enjoyed sports. And I just can't the way I used to, you know. Like I would cry if the Toronto Maple Leafs lost, you know. And now if the Toronto Maple Leafs lose, I really don't give a shit, right? And, but then I have this problem of like, why am I not enjoying this anymore? Like it's like this problem you can't get rid of. And then like I think a very important difference is the way they talk about reality. Is like they posit the notion of the real, which I'll go into in more depth from the Lacanian concept of the real, against this type of positivist external reality, like the world out there. Like the real is much more a kind of like an antagonism or a lack or a gap in being itself. Like it's like this constitutive problem. Like and this is where they really situate all analyses of like social sexual tension or social political tension as like some fundamental antagonism inherent to the very structure of being or something like that. And I find that very useful because, like, whenever it comes to like social dynamics, sexual dynamics, political dynamics, you know, we always try to point the finger at the lack in the other, like there's something in the other that's lacking, some problem in the other that if only that other were more like me, then things would be great, you know. Like, but this is not. This is a naive approach in their view. And then finally, like trying from this, you know, why bother even doing this? Also, is to rethink basically emancipatory politics in the 21st century. Is like, you know, like the 20th century emancipatory politics, like the serious, like real, authentic attempts at emancipatory politics, they failed. You know, like there's no illusions about this. They're nonsense. They absolutely were the wrong direction. But at the same time, it's kind of like, our lack of enthusiasm for politics leads to what we're in now. Like it's kind of like this feeling that like liberal democracies are the end of history, like Francis Fukuyama's end of history, like liberal democracies are the final form of historical becoming or something like that. This is also a mistake, like, because the current political landscape is an absolute mess. Like we need new thinking basically about what politics are. And I guess what they would say is that we need to see the coincidence also between the sexual and the political. But so that's my whatever. So that's my why I engaged with that school. So the overview, and I'm not going to be again I'll go into more detail. I'll try to go through it quickly as I can, but I want to give. First, I want to make a differentiation between meta-ontology and grand unified theory. So meta-ontology is basically, like we had a conversation just very briefly about like all you need is epistemology, you were saying. Like all you need is, you don't need ontology. But I say I agree with that, and that's how I think of meta-ontology in some sense, is basically inscribing epistemology into ontology. And inscribing epistemology into ontology, basically taking our knowledge practices seriously, ontologically seriously, that, and that's why I don't like the deconstructionists mostly, is because they don't take our knowledge seriously ontologically. So, like, to give an example of this, like, hopefully concrete, in terms of differentiating from grand unified theories and stuff like this, is, like, two dominant grand unified theories would be, like, quantum gravity and self-organization, I feel. Like, on the one hand, quantum gravity says, like, we're going to basically be able to unify the micro and the macro worlds, the quantum and the general relativistic, and that when we have this understanding of quantum gravity, we'll understand the whole universe, we'll understand the birth of the universe and the end of the universe and everything else in between. And then with self-organization theory is like more evolutionary theory, or even like universal Darwinists, like natural selection as like sublimating everything, and all substance can be explained by selection pressures and so forth. What I feel like all of this leaves out is precisely the status of the subject. And it's kind of comical. Like my favorite comical representation of this is like if you look at videos online of Stephen Hawking talking about a grand unified theory, it's always like we're going to discover this formula, and then it will like be on a T-shirt, and like then we'll be able to disperse this formula to everyone on the planet, and then like we'll all understand. And it's just like, it's like, yeah, but the problem of subjectivity is still here. Like history is going on. Like what about this continual motion of history and stuff? Like you have to inscribe the subject into the grand unified theory in order for it to make any sense. Like I have a friend who I quote, who said, the mystery of the grand unified theory is why jokes about the grand unified theory spread faster than the grand unified theory itself. Like, you know, like if someone writes a book about the grand unified theory, like just drops dead, like no one gives a shit, no one cares basically. You know, but you tell jokes spread like wildfire. So like just a
specific community.
Well, maybe. Well, but the biggest thing about like the grand unified theory is precisely that they don't reflect enough on the fact that their community believes they have the absolute truth, and the other community right next door to them is like, that's bullshit, man. Like Lee Smolin is my favorite for understanding this. Like Lee Smolin is a very, very sharp. I like to engage with him very deeply because he actually does a sociology of physics. It's like well done, and like he does a nice meditation on like, he even does the experiment himself. Like he says, I go to the string theory room, then I go to the loop quantum gravity room, then I go to the whatever, some other stupid theory room, and they all think they have the right theory. And they all think the person in the other room doesn't have the right theory. It's precisely the same structure as monotheistic religions. It's like the Islamist and the Christian, right? Like it's like, the Christian thinks he has the absolute truth. The Islamist thinks he has the absolute truth. It's like, you know, you both disagree with each other. Like, so how can, right? Like, so it's again this. How do we actually inscribe the motion of subjectivity into this this process? And then I'll go into like why dialectics, what are dialectics, why dialectics, and so forth. And then I want to give concrete examples how I sort of have tried to apply this tool of dialectics to the field as I understand it. Again, it's just a tool, and I'm sure each one of you will have their own way of relating to this field. And then basically, I want to end by provoking, basically saying, you know, I feel like the last 40 years kind of represent the death of metaphysics in some sense, like the death of taking metaphysics seriously, and that this can no longer hold. Like I feel like we're going to have a return of metaphysics, and for this we need real thinking. Like this is, for me, the impulse of the thinking school, is like to rethink metaphysics seriously, because I think it's necessary. So how I would define meta-ontology is, to me, the postmodern axiom is the map is not the territory, right? They'll often invoke this in relation to classical mechanics and Newtonian epistemology as they're basically responding to naive scientific materialists, basically. Like, you think your map is the exact territory, like you're not recognizing the gap between your map and the territory, and that you're not mapping the thing in itself. And this gap between the map and the territory is something that basically structures German idealism. Like if you study from Kant to Hegel, basically what they're working through is the complexities of the map is not the territory. Like Kant literally, like explicitly says that his philosophical impulse is to come up with a philosophy worthy of the Newtonian revolution. Like, and this to me reaches its climax with Hegel in some sense, because you get basically the map as territory itself. Like the conceptual map has its own territory, and we have to understand that in itself, the in itself of our own conceptual constructions and so forth. I'm going to lose my spot. So my major influences, and I'll go through them quickly, like, because each of them like sort of have their different resonance with me. For me, the reason why I start with Plato is on purpose, because all 20th century philosophers basically made a killing trying to deconstruct Plato. no one liked Plato in the 20th century. Like, you go through every philosopher in the 20th century, they all were like a rebellion against Plato. And I think that there's something deep in that, because Plato is like characterized straw man, like characterization as like the fixed ideal absolute that never changes, and it's like the pure ideality and stuff like this. But again, I think that there's some, like when I see the contemporary philosophical landscape, there's some unresolved coincidence between like pure mathematics and pure emotional thinking. Like pure mathematics and pure emotional thinking, there's some coincidence here between the two that we can't think yet, and I think like it's precisely this desire for oneness. Like I totally have no idea what the status of this desire for oneness is, but I've done personal experiments with this, like it's there. Like people want oneness, like it's not deconstructible. And this is against, so for example, like the main philosopher of postmodernism to me is Gilles Deleuze. And here's his principle against Plato. Like he's absolutely against Plato. This is principle of this is direct quote from 1,000 Platos. Quote, principle of multiplicity. It is only when the multiple is effectively treated as substantive, multiplicity, that it ceases to have any relation to the one. So you see here, Deleuze is not trying to articulate some one that is absent or something like that, some one that's not there. There's not even a one at all. Like it's just a pure multiplicity, right? And basically this like rhizomatic thinking, I think lays the metaphorical groundwork for like what we today think is network thinking. Like basically this is the multiplicity view, the network thinking. So that's against Plato. So, but the interesting thing like with Hegel is that Hegel's capable of basically injecting movement as fundamental. So like if we take the straw man characterization of Plato as this fixed absolute oneness, whatever, Hegel totally has no illusions here. Like it's just trying to understand the movement of the one itself. Like it's almost like the historical becoming of self-consciousness. Like you see the fixed images. And the interesting thing is like when we usually think of absolute love, we get this image of like the perfect sphere, the total sphere. Like even I've noticed my mom even operate like, and my mom is not an intellectual at all, but she gave a present to her husband, and it was just this perfect circle with the night sky on when they met. The night they met, she has it in a perfect circle and stuff like. It's like giving some coherence, giving some unity to like the fundamental emotional ground of the subject. Like it's absolutely necessary. And the interesting thing with Hegel is that the unity, like what we think of as a perfect sphere, is read purely from the point of view of a division, of a cut, right? So it's not like that my mom's perfect sphere, you know, grabs the totality of being or something like that. It's more her division into being, like her differentiation from everything else. Like everything else actually doesn't matter. Like as long as me and my husband are in this sphere, everything outside can go on as it is, as long as I'm in this bubble, you know? Like this is a division, a cut into being, an injection of a division. So I just want to quote Latin Dollar here because when I listened to some obscure lecture on Hegel, and when he said this quote, I was like, this is the minimal level of Hegel. Like if I could say this is anything I want to say about it. Is, quote, I think you can think this with like contemporary theories of quantum gravity with division and stuff like this. So the quote is, what cannot be divided any further is the division itself. The substance is permitted by the void, the atoms are permitted by the void, but the ancients did not have any inkling that this would have any relation to the place of the subject. This is Hegel at his minimum, the place of the subject. In the adage of substance and subject, the subject is the cut, introduced as the moving principle into being. So it's just, the subject is just nothing but this, you know, like my supervisor Francis Heiligen might say, these distinction dynamics, these repetitive cuts into being, like, and this is the subject. And so no grand unified theory, like as like this unity that's going to be imposed on us on a formula on a t-shirt. You don't stop the subject, you know, like they're just going to keep cutting away, like, and even I'll dedicate my whole career to proving you wrong. You know, like I'll dedicate my whole career to make sure your grand unified theory is I'll pull out the holes and the failures and the where it and so forth. So moving on to Lacan, I think I run the risk by I knew as soon as I started reading Lacan that I run the risk immediately of becoming an obscurantist. And I don't want to become an obscurantist, and the only way to not become an obscurantist with Lacan is to basically grab his formulas. Like, he often writes in very difficult prose, but you can pull out a formula and they make a lot of sense. So I think the most, and like, there's also a lot of obscurantism about the unconscious, and I think that's one reason why scientists don't like the unconscious. I think the second reason scientists don't like the unconscious is because they operate on principles of knowledge that they know, right? Where I think my favorite definition of the unconscious is, quote, a knowledge form which does not know itself. So a knowledge or form which does not know, which is constitutive of the unconscious. It's constitutive that it's a knowledge which you cannot know. So it's like, I want to situate this in relationship to there is no meta-language, because with meta-linguistic thought, you're on an asymptotic approach to full knowledge. Like, one day we'll get the full knowledge, like, and then all our language will be coherent and concise and stuff like this, but unconscious as a knowledge which doesn't know itself, you're not on an asymptotic approach to full knowledge. Like, you will never know it all, like, because the unconscious is constitutive of that you cannot know. So it forces you to accept the limitation, right, in some sense. So that's what I want to say, that's what I take away from Lacan. I go into more detail. And then finally with Zizek, I think what he does is he pulls out from all of this the impossibility at the core of self-consciousness almost. Like the impossibility of self-consciousness to really know itself, the impossibility of self-consciousness to know its desire, to know its heart, to know even what it wants to do in the world, and so forth, and really pulls out the consequences of encountering this impossibility. And I think that where he deploys it most, like what Less Than Nothing is about, is the distinction between something and nothing. And he flips the distinction between something and nothing in the exact way in which I tried to do it when I was a pure, insane atheist. Like, when I was, like, very atheist, I would watch everything, like, that could guarantee that for sure I have all the arguments so that it's no God. And I was watching one special documentary series where they interviewed a whole bunch of people about why there's no God. And the only video which gave me pause on the question was this theologian who brought up the question of something and nothing. And I was like, well, that actually, I can't think of a good counter-argument, like, for something and nothing. Like, the problem of something and nothing is really a difficult problem. And, like, I think here science reaches its absolute limit. And here, even there's a coincidence here in our current ideological landscape between science and Buddhism, because science occupies itself with something, and Buddhism occupies itself with nothing, precisely. I'm
sorry, I must interrupt.
Okay.
As you make the third misconception of Buddhism.
Okay.
But okay, please go on.
Okay, yeah, we can have it. I could have my interpretation of Buddhism totally wrong, but like we'll have that discussion. So, but it's just that I think that in the coincidence of working out something and nothing, like I think that there's we need a new ontology for thinking this difference. So, but the next thing I want to say is that, like, in presenting this conceptual scheme as like a linear progressive narrative, like from Plato to Hegel to Lacan to Zizek, to me it's if you read any of these philosophies, none of them can be interpreted in a linear progressive formula. What they talk about is a paradoxical circularity, and it's not a circularity like the ancient circle of the perfect circle. It's more a circle that's internally twisted in itself, like that the geometric structure of the circle has a weird torsion in it, like a weird twist in it. And that the point of understanding this geometry is it introduces retroactivity. And retroactivity is where you can't have any more past, present, future. It's rather that the future transforms the past. So the future directed motion of the subject will retroactively change what you think of the past. So it's not like, for example, like I'll give an example with physics with this as well. Like it's not that like the future directed motion of physicists discovering the Big Bang caused the Big Bang. Like, of course not. Like, the Big Bang happened or something, but the point is that the future directed motion of physicists discovering the Big Bang retroactively changes the way we think about the past. And then that will, the next generation of physicists, their projects will be different based on that new retroactive understanding of the past, like trying to recreate the conditions of the Big Bang and so forth at the Large Hadron Collider and stuff like this. So I think retroactivity is important to think, which is that you never know what future humans 100 years from now will be thinking about the past. And this is what retroactivity insists that we try to think. And so, like, for example, with this is like not going back to Plato, like the static fixed oneness, but what happens to Plato when you inject movement, unconscious, impossibility, and so forth. Then you can think, then you go back to Plato and you read something, the past literally changes. So that's what I try to do there. Then, like, to meta-ontology, it's like, this is like an, yep.
Are you saying that, like, our interpretation of how we take in the past changes? Or?
Our interpretation of what the past is changes.
Yeah.
For example, take for example Edward Said's book Orientalism is a good example of this. If anyone's read Edward Said's Orientalism, is like, but it's a basic colonial point. Like, once colonialism emerges, like the pasts of Africa or the pasts of Asia or the past of America are gone. Like how Africans imagine, even me saying Africans, like Indians, like. Those categories don't exist before European colonialism and so forth. Like, people on the Indian subcontinent didn't see themselves as Indian. I think that's like basic Edward Said's point. Like, Edward Said's point is like the Orient was a concept forced on them by the European colonial expansion and so forth, and then they became the Orient all of a sudden, like, okay, we're Oriental. So it's kind of like the past is retroactively reorganized by the future motion and so forth. So, so with this network view, like, this is to me, meta-ontology is like, but when you see this network, like, try to understand it ontologically, like, what's going on here? Like, what is this network of philosophers? Like, do they have their own, does the network of philosophers have their own movement, their own unconscious, their own impossibility, their own oneness that they're striving for, and so forth? And, like, to me, that's where network thinking has to be avoided, which is you introduce the impossibility at the core of the philosophical project, like this absolute knowledge which they try to circle around, basically. And so,
excuse me.
Yep.
Do you say now this is the point where network thinking should be avoided?
Like, that network theory reaches its limits for me.
Okay.
Not that network theory is wrong. Like, I think network theory is useful, and I think
with the question you want to answer, network theory would be to limit.
To me, the metaphor, like, so I would say, like, okay, these are metaphors.
Yeah.
So like the metaphor of the rhizome, or the metaphor of the multiplicity, or the metaphor of the network, to me, I think they're extraordinarily useful. Like, obviously they're useful, or else they wouldn't have become popular.
Right.
Like, that people find them, people applied them, people get some utility out of it. But to me, when it comes to understanding the human system specifically, I reach limitations in my thinking with multiplicity or network thinking. Like,
yes.
And like, I would say, like, here, like, to provoke, like, with meta-ontology or absolutist substance, but also subject, like, in regards to, like, the paradox to me of systems theory in your field, which is, like, precise, or like even like autopoiesis, autopoietic thinking and stuff like this is like, I think the problem for me is, like, on the one hand, we're capable of thinking general systems and paradoxical self-referential circularity and stuff like this, but then the problem reaches on the level of our actual historical motion, all the subjects aren't integrated into systems theory, like all the subjects reject this integration into systems theory, or like, how does systems theory or autopoiesis or any of these notions actually change our political economic landscape? We haven't seen that, right? Like, or even reinterpreting, like, sexuality and love and family structure and all this. Like, it doesn't even approach this a little bit. Like, to me, it doesn't change it at all. Like, we have the same. Well, we can talk after.
So it's the limit of the theory or the limit of
the limit of our theory, like our ability to think the subject.
Yeah.
Like, to me, it's all about the inability to think the subject, like, in a radical way. Like, it's almost like the theory is a defense mechanism for actually thinking the subject. Like, if we can just put up this theory, then we don't really have to think too much about ourselves and what's going on here. Yep.
Just a question, have you ever considered Emmanuel Levinas in this network?
Ah,
Oh, okay.
so we go deeper and there's Levinas and so forth. So then you have, like, you can go, my provocation to someone like Foucault, like, who wrote Archaeology of Knowledge, is can we write archaeology of knowledge that's not historical relativist archaeology of knowledge? Like, that's Foucault's historical relativist provocation, like you can deconstruct everything, we could do archaeology of knowledge. But what if there's an invariant real here as like, what's the antagonism? What's the antagonism at the heart of philosophy? Like, why do people even bother? So like, is there like some invariant real here that is worth looking at? But this is, so, and then you can go deeper, ancient world. So my point here is like, you saw my meta-ontology. So my meta-ontology, I said Plato, Hegel, Lacan, Zizek, where does that take? But it's totally open. Like, if you, just say, so if you start with Buddha, then you go to Spinoza, then you go to Schopenhauer, then say Sam Harris or something like that, what can you think? Like, it's just, you can play with this. Like, it's totally open. Like, where's your starting axiomatic foundation? Then where do you go next in the modern world, postmodern world, and so forth? And then what can you think? So it's basic, and so like my point here is this metaphor is the metaphor of curved space-time. And the reason why I like the metaphor of curved space-time over the metaphor of the network is because the curved space-time inscribes an impossibility into it. Like it's precisely that with curved space-time you have singularities that are a constitutive feature of the curved space-time. It's not just, like, it is all relational, but it's relational, and also there's a non-relation there. There's an absolute there. That's a part of the curved space-time. So that's why I like the metaphor of curved space-time more. And you can play with it. This is just a tool you can play with. You pick whatever thinker, and I think we do this spontaneously anyway. Like, you know, we think about what's our foundational axiom, like who's the thinker that we resonate with deeply the most. Then logically, where do we go then, and so forth, and how do we push a new frontier in this way. But now I go to dialectics. So, the first thing with dialectics is that for me, dialectics are simply a conversation mediated by reason and aimed at truth, but like not some truth in the sense of like something that like some substance that doesn't change over time. But really, like the conversation mediated by reason is in some sense trying to get at some truthful coordinates of our becoming. Like basically, every direction is not okay. Like, it's not that it's just a pure multiplicity. Anything is okay. Like, and the problem is like, where are the limits here? Like, because the problem of where are the limits here is precisely to me a religious question, because like in the traditional world, like, you knew what the limits were. It has a transcendental limit. Like, and the book is from on high and stuff like that, and you can't question the limits. But when you remove this transcendental limitation, then the question of like, why would I listen to some other human limiting me? Like it's just another human just like me, so why does he get to, or he or she get to limit me in some absolute way? Like, but at the same time, when you just fall into like a spiraling multiplicity of no direction and stuff like that, I think nihilism sinks in pretty quickly. So, and so forth. So, the starting point for Plato with dialectics was the contradictory or oppositional character of human existence. Basically, dualism, like the dualistic nature of the appearances. Like, even like I would say, like the primordial gesture of Plato is trying to resolve this difference between the supernatural one and like the void of nihilism and stuff like that. You would have, and he called that like the sophists or or doxa, like the people in opinion, right? Like and versus the theological types, the absolute oneness, where like basically you have the absolute law and then there's no more movement of reason after that, right? Like it's just you already have the answers. So he's trying to operate in this in-between space between these two, and this still operates today. Like I still in my intellectual atmosphere, in my intellectual environment, you'll have the religious zealots, and you'll have you'll have like what Plato would call the sophists, I suppose. So it still operates. But these dualities are obviously everywhere. Like they're intuitive, and we just think about them in this way. Like so, for example, there's so many of them. Like they're endless. So like light, dark, order, chaos, masculine, feminine, life, death, peace, war, health, sickness, temporality, eternity, movement, stillness. Like movement, stillness is an interesting one. Something, nothing, and so forth. So this is where the dialectic finds its home, is in this play between the opposites, this contradiction inherent to our being in some sense. So obviously then the triadic logic that they come up with to deal with this is a thesis, it's taken many different forms, like the thesis, antithesis, synthesis is one particular form you can approach it with. It has other names, but like that's the one I often find most useful. So for example, I think the important point in we'll get more into it, but the important point is regard the third term, the synthesis, which is that the third term is totally an open term. Like the synthesis is not a closure. It's not that you reconcile the opposites in eternity. Like it's that the opposites become reconciled in some interesting way, and then you get a new oppositional determination. You open yourself up onto a new field. So for example, this is for example, what communism can't think, like communist theory. If you actually talk to communists about what does world communism look like, they have no idea. All they can do is critique capital. And they do it well, but then but what is communism? Then they just fall flat. So but it's just to me the problem so you have, say, the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, the thesis and the antithesis. Then you have come up with a synthesis, world communism, and you get rid of those two categories. But then what is the oppositional determination of the other system? Is it, I have my own ideas, but just what is that new oppositional, because it's not, the ideology is that you reconcile the opposites and then you have utopia. And this is ideology. It's not going to be utopia. It might even be worse. It might even be more traumatic. If we're all living together, for Christ's sake.
I need my coffee break.
Right. Yeah. Already, I'm probably too much. Right. My favorite one with God is So thesis, there is a God, one. Antithesis, there is no God, no one. There's no one there. Synthesis, there is a not one. So there is a not one is that, of course, there's no other there that's going to hold me and take me in, but at the same time I want, it still affects, even if there's no God, the Crusades still happened, people still fucking, it's like a paradoxical absence that still has efficacy and so forth, people still go to Sunday church every morning, or every Sunday, and go listen to a pastor and so forth. There's still something of a nothing here. That's at work. So my point is that synthesis, there is a not one, it doesn't resolve anything. It just introduces a new paradox. What is that? And now, who knows what that is. So why dialectics is that the tendency of the human mind is to, especially in reason, the tendency is to close itself, to come up with a fixed set of distinctions, to come up with a fixed set of concepts, that is now I have the concepts, and now I've closed the system. And dialectics is simply, no, basically, dialectics is basically every identity, the truth of it is its dissolution. The truth of it is that it will dissolve away. There's nothing eternal in any person who comes to you giving you some sort of absolute truth. Is the truth is that they're going to die and pass away, and their distinctions will fade away as well. So basically it's focusing on, it's basically taking the discursivity of self-consciousness in history as an object of analysis, as something of something of ontological significance to study, to pay close attention to the way people talk, and what they're saying and what they believe and the way their antagonisms emerge in the discursive space and stuff like this. What my personal view is that like the interesting thing about Plato and Hegel is that their very work is higher order. Like their very work is a discursive process. Like that's the point of the Socratic dialogues and stuff like that, is that you'll have many if you read like Parmenides or something, like you'll have many different, it's not just Plato talking, like it's many different figures of consciousness talking, and he'll deploy them one off of the other, like, and basically explore the immanence of their logic. Like if I explore this conversation, where does the logical trajectory go and stuff like that? And that's basically what Hegel did with history. Like he basically tried to understand the logical motion of history itself and stuff like that, and where he could take that, and basically came to like a horizon of death, basically, like the other side of self-consciousness as its dissolution. So yeah. So then first let's look at Plato. So my claim with Plato is that like logic can totally hold Plato still today. For example, and my favorite example of that is if you read Roger Penrose's The Road to Reality. If you just open up the first chapter, the second chapter, he has a Platonic diagram which structures the whole of his Road to Reality. And basically how logic can easily still hold Plato is that you know, the Big Bang as the birth of the physical could still totally logically have been God. Then physical gives rise to mental, and then the mental returns to God somehow. You know, the historical process is some return. It's not saying that's true, but I'm saying that that's still easily possible for logic to hold that structure. So in Plato's meta-ontological view, you have physical, mental, transcendental, where the physical is like the illusory cave world, the mental is what's observing the illusory cave world, and then you have outside of the cave as the absolute truth, the oneness. And that basically the difference between the two philosophical coordinates that I've been reading is like the provocation of the difference between democratic materialism and dialectical materialism, where dialectical materialism is not saying there's like some fixed absolute truth that doesn't change, but that we're not just bodies and languages. That like democratic materialism would basically be anything goes, like it's just bodies and languages here. And dialectical materialism still insists on the mediation of truth, that there is still some direction here, there is still some meaning to the historical process that we don't understand, that we're still trying to work out through discursivity and so forth, that they're not willing to give up on truth, basically. So in Plato's ontology, basically it's monism. So like what's much more popular in metaphysics today is non-dualism. But Plato's ontology is monistic. There is only one. And then the multiplicity is illusion, and you just have to see through the illusion for the oneness. And so like in Parmenides, the quote here would be, the famous quote would be, human nature was originally one, and we were a whole, and the desire in pursuit of the whole is called love. So basically here's like the coincidence here of Plato's emotional and mathematical theory, like where his sexual theory was like we were divided at the beginning of time by the gods into man and woman, and that our attempt to reunite with the oneness is like trying to find your other half, and you spend your whole life trying to find your other half, and you never do, and stuff like this. So that's basically Plato's monism.
Was the part that you never do a part of the theory, or is it your addition?
I don't want to speak for Plato. I don't want to. I will speak for Plato. No, I will speak for Plato because I read in his older age, he thought that it was the greatest freedom to be liberated from libidinal energy. Mm-hmm. Like he's like from libidinal energy. Like in his old age, when he became impotent. Yeah, when he became impotent. Yeah, he's like, this is the biggest liberation. Like I no longer have to worry about this.
How useful?
Yeah, well, not very. Your usefulness is useful. Your uselessness becomes useful. Like I no longer work. So
yeah.
So there it goes. Okay. So then, to me, with Hegel and Lacan, you basically get a complexification an increased sophistication with this triadic structure. So, and each of them has their own purpose, their own object of analysis. So like with Hegel, his object is self-consciousness and the motion of self-consciousness, and with Lacan, it's the motion of unconsciousness. And consequently, they differ in their object of analysis, where like Hegel's interested in the historical becoming of self-consciousness, and Lacan's interested in basically the underground of the subject, if you want, like the knowledge that the knowledge that the psychic system doesn't know internal to the psychic system in some sense. And so the reason for that differentiation is important, I think, because in Hegel's structure you have nature, logic, spirit. And so then spirit, what spirit is basically the immanence of the relation between logic and nature. Like logic is processing nature, like logic goes out into nature and then returns to itself, and this is the becoming of spirit. So like for example, like when I was 17, I would think a lot about Jupiter, or I would think a lot about the Andromeda Galaxy or stuff like that, but I don't think about those anymore. Like I've already done with those, like I'm finished, like they're out.
And with Toronto,
yeah, it's out of my system now, and so forth. Like I've thought enough about that, and now like my logic is much more situated like at singularities and like objects that are much more difficult to understand and stuff like that. So, but this is like the motion of spirit and stuff like this.
Cadell, 20 minutes, okay?
Okay, yeah. So, and then with Lacan, it's much more like he totally understood the break between Kant and Hegel. Like, so nature becomes imaginary. Like, there's no illusions in Lacan about getting at nature in itself, like some external out there. Like, anything that, like nature is an imaginary construction of humans, basically. And that we try to apply to this imaginary construction of nature some symbolical, logical operations, which will help us to better basically predict the movement of whatever this is outside. And the real is much more like the gap, like basically the real is why nature still persists. Like basically, like the real is basically like nature's still there somehow, like even though we apply our symbolic logic and we still, you know. So then basically with this logical structure, you get an interesting A equals B, like it's basically inscribes the contradiction into identity itself. Like there's no such thing as a non-contradictory identity. Like identity is a contradiction, or identity is a paradox, but it's seeing it in its positive determination. It's not seeing it like, oh, identity is contradictory and paradoxical, so we'll just deconstruct all the identities. It's, let's work out what is this paradox at the core of identity and stuff like this. And then again, to me, the important way to avoid ideology here is that the C, the synthesis, is not some resolution to the paradox or some resolution to the contradiction as such. It's a resolution to a particular paradox or a particular contradiction, but then a new paradox and a new contradiction will quickly open up. So it's not that you have paradox or contradiction and then you have, again, we're on some asymptotic approach to the truth, like to like the full resolution of things, you know, like it's just this motion. And this is, I think, different than the triangles you'll see in, like, for example, Stephen Wolfram's a new kind of science. Like, in A New Kind of Science, you'll have these repeating triangles. Like, but the problem with his repeating triangles is that they're too closed. Like, they're not open enough. Like, again, the third term is a strange term. Like, it's a ontologically strange term. Like, even, I don't know. Well, I'll get there one day. So here I want to like concretely deploy this logic to interpret history. So on the first box you'll see the level of the subject, and on the second box is you'll see the level of civilization. So here, like in terms of the contradiction or the paradox of the subject in history, first you have, say, the religious subject, and the religious subject as its contradiction, it can't reach its notional ideal of itself. So of course, like the notional ideal of the religious subject would be something like Jesus or Buddha or something like this, some ideal subject that they're tending towards, right? Like yogi, right? And the contradiction of the identity is that it can't do this. Like it's never going to be able to do this. Like it just can't work out this paradox internal to its own core of identity becoming. So it then, yeah, go ahead.
I think that's an important point. Contradiction is a process of end-paradoxing in time.
Mm.
Yeah. So the paradox, identity is first paradox, and then when we try to work it through, we see then the contradiction comes. It
Right.
works. Yeah.
Right, right. So then, like, by engaging in the appearances, that you're going to encounter internal contradictions, like,
Yeah.
right. So it's just a part, it's a feature of the identity.
Yeah.
So then, like, logically, then if A can't become A, then A becomes B. So religious subject transforms into secular subject. But then the secular subject has its own crazy notional ideals, and then these crazy notional ideals also can't be achieved. So then you're like, well, now what do I do? Like, I can't become A, I can't become B. Now what is C? And who knows what C is, right? So like the crazy notional ideal of the secular subject would be like that somehow its intervention into history would like reconcile things, like obviously the best example would be like the communist subject, like the real authentic communist subject trying to bring about world communism or something like this, and then like obviously it can't do it. So go on, now what do I do? And so forth. So then like on the level of civilization, it's like the same thing on a meta level. So like you have the identity of the church, and the identity of the church as like the kingdom of heaven is its like notional ideal, and then it obviously can't do this. So then transform church into state, A becomes B, and then the state has as its ideal, like even like many people have illusions about the state today, like the state as like some agent of utopia, some agent that if we could just reconcile the state with our being, then everything will be great. So, but then the big question here, and like this is the interesting thing about dialectical thinking to me, is it like it logically brings you to, okay, well, what is the next identity at work
What
here?
is C?
Yeah, what is C? Yeah, this is very open here. Like we have no idea. To me, we have absolutely no idea. Like, and I think this is where philosophy should like again, like if you ask communists about what world communism looks like, they have no idea. Like but Marx even like the important thing to know about Marx is, from my point of view, is like the early Marx was totally romantic. Like he wrote like these basically like these utopian manifestos of like world communism's right around the corner and stuff like that. And then if you look at his bibliography, he stops writing. And then like a decade or 2 decades later, he releases Capital, and it's just this analysis of capitalism, you know, like this monster that has been underestimated and so forth. Okay, so now to give some concrete examples. So like for me, again, these concrete examples are the way I'm seeing the field, but like you might see the field totally differently. Like maybe I'm wrong on like most of them. Like I have no idea. This is just sort of like how I'm encountering this logic. So to me, the 2 different ways in which you can play with the 2 and the 1 is like the conservative. I think the conservative psychical tendency is 2 becomes 1. Like it tries to take 2 things and put them into 1 and reconcile them. And like I think this is like how like the conservative movement even ontologically structures itself. And then for me, the revolutionary, they always take a unity and they say it's flawed and it has holes, and they try to break it apart. Like they try to cut it down, basically. So the conservative is trying to preserve some unity, I feel, and the revolutionary is trying to break some unity so that there could be something new, something different. So the first is quantum mechanics and general relativity. So like, for example, this oppositional determination has structured physics for like 100 years. On the quantum mechanical side, it's basically like the physical world is incomplete and uncertain, it's indeterminate and fuzzy, it involves paradoxes of observation. New Age people take it and say that means reality is created by observation and stuff like this. But somehow that what is objective, somehow with like what is subjective is inscribed into what is objective somehow, and general relativity just can't deal with that in any meaningful way. Like even like I read some like some self-autobiography of Einstein where he talks about like, I'm totally satisfied with my description of the space-time manifold, but for some reason experience and emotions totally, I have no idea. Like they don't fit, basically. So like here, again, like the status of the observer basically has the fixed space-time background still. Like he can't let that go. And then general relativity, so like you basically have a relational dynamical manifold that's relativistically constituted and stuff, and like strange things can happen with the space-time manifold, like precisely that something can come out of nothing, and like and then something can go back to nothing and stuff like that, which is not even possible in Newtonian mechanics. So that's one oppositional determination, and last night I just tried to inject a third term just for fun, because I don't know, but like just in each term, there are two I couldn't come up with a third term for. But of course, some quantum gravity is supposedly going to reconcile these two, and then what would then be the new oppositional determination and so forth. So the next one is I feel like this one structured my mind in my intellectual becoming the most, is like I feel like the antagonism between evolution and change and God and eternity. Like I feel evolutionary ontology is to me so much more superior to Newtonian ontology, because what it does is it injects like life and death into ontology, like all of a sudden like living and dying and surviving and all this stuff is like becomes ontological. And I think that like the problem for me with evolutionary theorists is precisely when they reach the level of human history. It's like we need a better, I think, evolutionary theory of religion itself or philosophy itself. Like they don't take religion seriously enough as an object of study to me. So, and like my biggest like I guess provocation with like religious subjects and like the debate between evolutionary theorists and like religious theorists would be like, in all the debates I've watched, it's like the evolutionary theorist could give a totally convincing description of being. Like, totally convincing. I can answer all of your questions about being. But then the religious subject will continue believing. Like, it will just continue believing. Like, and this persistence of the religious belief, I think, is what's interesting. Not in the sense that, like, religious identity isn't contingent. Like, religious identity is contingent, but what about this continued motion? And like for me, this is one I really don't know yet, but like this idea of a circular universe, like actually inscribing circularity into our cosmological foundations. So like basically cosmology is such an infant, it's such a young science, and it's a science that's like changing every decade basically as new information comes in, and like we have no idea whether like in 10 years or in 20 years our total understanding of cosmology will be different. And I think for me the big thing to think with all this stuff in cosmology is like, Lee Smolin actually said something interesting. He said, there's an interesting parallel between cosmology and social science, because both sciences have to think the observer within the system. Like that you can't actually have a cosmology under the scientific paradigm of the external observer, because you're in the universe. Like you're in it. And so that's the same, like an interesting parallel between cosmology and social science. The next one would be like scientific objectivity and humanities subjectivity. These are another interesting oppositional determination. So like on the sciences you'll have external observation, formulating tests that can be repeated, locating ourselves in relation to a knowable nature. Like Seifen, you brought up some interesting points about science's assumptions, right? Like we assume that nature is orderly, or we assume that we can know nature and stuff like this. I think those are, and then like the humanities is much more based on experience of subjectivity, story, right? Like the world is made out of stories, not atoms, or something like that. Interpretation and conjecture all of a sudden become important. All of these things. And well, I won't go into my. It's too long, 'cause
Now it got interesting. No, you show it.
Okay, so my I just don't know how much time I have left.
7 minutes.
Okay, so my synthesis is the notion of a psychoid. So the notion of a psychoid, the notion of a psychoid was I pulled this. It's not my concept. I pulled it from an obscure book, correspondence between Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli. So Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli had this discourse between like psychology and physics, and they were going back on like how do we think this and stuff like that. And the concept that kept coming back as interesting to me was a psychoid, which was like basically an objectivity that inscribes subjectivity into its constitution.
Okay.
And so like basically you get like this, like to me, for example, like even, I guess my favorite example of the psychoid would be like my ayahuasca experience, I suppose. Like in my ayahuasca, and like the psychoid has the opposite structure of like nature, I think. Because like the way we know nature is like each subjectivity can like say, like for example, like Mars is going to move there then. Like we have a model to say when Mars is going to be there or something like that. And then we can all confirm through tests like, oh, Mars did show up there. Like, or like the early scientists, like they would do it with like comets. Like, can we predict when this comet will fly here?
Yeah.
And then they did, and then they're like, oh, okay, then we're doing good then. But then, like with the psychoid, it's the opposite. So like for example, I always give the example: if you're an anthropologist watching people at an ayahuasca ceremony. Okay, so in an ayahuasca ceremony, I'd say I'm in the ceremony and you're watching me.
Yeah.
So I'm in the circle, moving rhythmically back and forth in my psychoid,
Yes.
right? And somehow we're all symmetrically moving back and forth, all somehow coordinated.
Okay.
And now from you watching me, it's just like, there's just like a body of humans moving rhythmically. But then the mystery to me is that internally to each of our phenomenal consciousnesses, we're somehow all in some psychical transcendental state, but we're not merged with each other. Like it's not like I merge with the person next to me. It's like we all just go up into the psychoid and we're all like being almost like moved by it almost. But it can't be externally observed is my point.
Yep.
Like it can only be internally observed. It's internal external. So it's a psychoid.
Okay, that was fun. Thank you.
Is it some
Closer to Buddhism?
Cadell, is it
Is
is it some form of group resonance?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
like
Internal,
animistic
external?
or
Like it's like somehow we're all entangled in our movement somehow. Like but it's not like, for me anyway. Like Gael and I have talked about, we have like I don't know. Like here it's just a mystery. I don't know. Like, but to me I don't experience it as I merge with the other subject. Like I don't experience it like, say, me and Marta at the ayahuasca. I don't experience like me and Marta are one or something.
yeah,
I experience it as like somehow we're
yeah.
We're in some
you're
common
plugged
space.
into some common.
But
But there's
because
some
you
experience.
walk and you don't.
Somehow it's like it might not even be like, I'm just off the top of my head. So I wonder even if like it's similar to the experience of like we're both from the same nation, or we're both from the same religious tribe, like, or it's some sort of like we're one.
Because coordinated movement doesn't require any sophistication. Just you watching and you are now doing coordinated movement.
Yeah, but everyone has their
No,
eyes.
but
Everyone's in like some sort of psychical trance. Like you're not really there.
But you are
Anyway,
you are also there.
I just want to get through all the distinctions quickly then, because so.
Cadell, 3 minutes.
Okay, so there's analytical continental. So I'm not going to be able to do the end part, but like analytical continental, like to me the what needs to be resolved here is like, as far as I understand, is like the analytical is much more like coming up with a universal logical framework that could be shared, like basically like putting huge emphasis on like the power of mathematics and symbolic logic to share information with any other subjectivity and stuff like this. And then the continental is much more transcendental, trying to get at like these unrepeatable experiences that are somehow universal to everyone, but like you can't predict them, you can't, like they're just your raw experience. Then left and right. This is obviously like a huge provocation, these symbols, but like basically, like I feel like the contemporary political landscape in the 21st century is like reenacting old forms from the 20th century, because they just don't know what else to reenact. Like they're basically like organized, like the leftist progressives are basically operating under the same logic of communism, and then like the people on the right are trying to reenact ethno-states and stuff like this. And like I think like the rise of like people trying to reenact ethno-states is like, I mean, it's happening. I don't know what to make. I don't know what to make of it. But like these forms are reproducing themselves in the 21st century. I think because we don't have any new political thinking. Like we can't think what's going on actually right now. So I think, and this is one of the ones where like I have no idea. Like I just have absolutely, I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. Like it's just like.
Psychoid.
Yeah,
Psychoid.
Life on
Politics.
Mars.
Right. Well, I don't know, but then we just reproduce new antagonisms. Like, so that the next one is like the difference between individuation and collectivity. Like, how do you think psychology and society together? Like, what's the relationship between these two? The concept I like is transindividuation. Actually, like it's actually a Deleuzean concept or Gilbert Simondon concept, like transindividuation. Because the reason why I like transindividuation is because I don't like notions in progressive theory like where they like romanticize the commune, or they romanticize the social group, like that we're going to be happy in a social group together. Like, no, we're not going to be happy in a social group. Like, it's going to fail. So and then man and woman. I would love to go into more depth with this one, but like again, time. And this is another one where I have no idea. Like, but like all I can be sure of is that the binary of on the one hand, the people who like basically do evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology of sexuality, and then the other hand, the people who are like in gender theory and stuff like this. All I can be sure of is that they're both absolutely wrong. Like, and I think that like because I think it's more important, because I think it affects politics more. I think the people in gender theory are totally wrong because and I have an exact quote I would love to share from Alenka Zupancic about this, because I'm reading her book What is Sex, who I'd highly recommend reading. And what she says is the problem with gender theory is precisely that they desexualize sex. Like, and as soon as you desexualize sex, you've lost it. Like you just way off the ball. And and a good example is actually like the Me Too movement. Like the Me Too, like there's nothing wrong with the Me Too movement. Like it's a fantastic political force and so forth. But they totally obfuscate the sexual tension and like all the sexual dynamics. Now, what do? Like it's almost like we don't want to approach some of the most difficult conversations about sex, and I think that's how sex functions anyway. Like,
Time is up.
okay, so matter, mind. So then you have.
Talk about it.
Okay, so then I'll let you go for lunch, and then we'll do it. So then you have like matter, mind. Obviously, that's an old one. Life and death. And then something and nothing. And then I was going to go on into more, but you can watch it on this whole video is on my YouTube channel, and I'll let you go. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Cadell.